So, by the miracle of modern technology, we've got Emilio San Pedro, who's... Are you in the BBC office in Miami?
No,
At home?
no, I'm not. I'm home in a balcony.
On my right, we've got... well, I'm Nick Caister. I worked for the BBC for many years and did several Cuba programs. 2005, I did a program for Radio 4 and for the World Service called Cuba After Castro. And he was so taken aback by it that he immediately fell ill, I think. I've also done, I must admit, I've done his obituary, but I think the way things are going, he's probably going to outlive me, so that will probably never get aired. And I'll be chairing tonight. We'll have about an hour, I think, of these gentlemen speaking, and then over to you. On my right is Pedro Sarduy, who's a Cuban-born poet and lecturer and journalist who also worked in the BBC for a number of years. And who doesn't look a year older than when I first met him about 25 years ago. But he's going to tell us his first-hand experiences of the arrival of the revolution. On my left, Richard Gott, who's written widely on Latin America and on Cuba. He's just pointed out that one of the seminal works that he did back in the 70s, I think originally, called the guerrilla movements in Latin America, when Penguin had that series, which is now very hard to find, when Latin America was very much in the news. And Richard wrote about the guerrilla movements there, and more recently he's written a very authoritative but also very readable book on a new history of Cuba, which covers, I think, from the colonial times, from the discovery times onwards. And on my far left then is Steve Wilkinson, who's the assistant director of the Institute of Studies on Cuba at the London Metropolitan University, and the author of a book, he tells me, on Cuban detective fiction. So maybe that'll be a different kind of perspective for tonight's discussion. I hope it can be a discussion. We'll be talking up here and hearing the points of view here, but then I'm very keen to hear what you have to say about Cuba at 50. This, of course, is actually the very week that the Barbudos, that the revolutionists took over power in Cuba. Batista fled on New Year's Eve, 1958, it would have been then, and Che and Camilo led columns to Havana, but Fidel was in the east in Santiago, and it always struck me as a very religious symbolism that these bearded leaders came out of the east following a star, a revolutionary star, and reached Havana the day after 12th night. And that religious symbolism, I thought that was just my fantasy, but it was emphasized to me by eyewitnesses who saw Fidel's first speech in what became Plaza de la Revolucion in Havana, and they felt that his power there was symbolized and was made concrete by the fact that, according again to eyewitnesses, that a white dove settled on his shoulder when he was giving that first speech, which was again a symbol for the Orisha, for the people who have power in the Santeria religion. And so I think there's a religious dimension to all this, which maybe we won't get into, but more than that. But we have with us someone who actually witnessed the revolution, and not only witnessed the revolution, but was living in Santa Clara when Che Guevara took it. So I'd like to start with Pedro and how that felt. What happened?
Well, you know, what can I say? As Pablo Neruda used to say in his writing, confieso que he vivido. For those of you who speak Spanish, I mean, 50 years gone by, and a day like yesterday was when Fidel spoke at my hometown, Santa Clara. As you said, it was a kind of holiest or miracle day, because in many parts of our culture background, like Spain, for instance, we celebrate El Día de Reyes, which is January the 6th, the Epiphany, which was yesterday. And I remember when Deborah mentioned invite me to come over to this forum, I thought that that would be the day after of Fidel arrival at Santa Clara and that wonderful speech he gave. And because a few days before, I was 15, almost 50 years old, Che Guevara arrived in my hometown, Santa Clara, and I went to see on the first last week the first part of Che Guevara, the film, and I was recreating and memorizing those years, and that precisely that day, which was very important to us, my generation of Cubans in town. It was the last nail in the coffin of Batista's regime. It was very tough for us, not necessarily for my generation, but for my people. And I remember gathering in front of the ayuntamiento, la mairie, the town hall,
yeah.
In the city hall of Santa Clara, where Fidel spoke, and it was very significant for us, mostly because my hometown, Santa Clara, was a very racially segregated city in multiple folds. And what Fidel said in that very same first speech in Santa Clara meant a lot to my people, my generation, and then colleges, universities, often open for my kind of people. And that was why, to me, these 50 years of revolution is so significant and very important.
Did you see the fighting of Che taking Santa Clara?
Yes,
were you caught up in that?
Yep, I was there. Not caught up, we were there. And we were there because I was in the Bachillerato, which is it's not the GCSE, but it's something that is the form before the university. And we knew what was going on. I have a cousin of myself who came down from the mountain with the grade of captain, Felipe Perez, and he was in the Escambray Mountains. And he's already 5 years older than me, so I was looking at him as if I could be him in that sense. But our role, it was a role of what the film shows, which is the population and mostly young people involved in that sort of sabotage, to throw things, burn tires, involved in the trying to avoid that the tanks were moved around the city. And I live, my grandmother, where I used to live with at the time, it was very close to where was the derailment of the train. It was about 200 meters across the other side of the river. And Che Guevara had to come by that road because it was on the way to attacking the police station. All this breaking through whole house after house, knocking that was real. And it was amazing. We didn't know at the time because the airplane was bombing the area of the railway. And we have to, my house, my grandmother's house was a wooden roof house, and any time that the bomb of 250 pounds rocketed in the ground, the thing was really crumbling down. But we were out on the street. I was 14 and a half. I was born in May 1943, so I will be 15 soon after that. And but it was a lot of memory. We were in the street trying just to help the troops, and Che Guevara came in front of us because it's the Calle Martí is the straight, one of the road that leads, a parallel road leads to the police station. And so I was that man. I was really paralyzed. I couldn't see. It was a very impressive character. He was just waving slowly with his safe hand. He had this right hand and doing this to the people. It seems, and next back to him was Aleida, who was his partner later on. And then we were there on the 28th, the 29th, giving drink and food and trying to help some kind of logistic as a student as we were, without knowing, even if we knew that something different could happen for the future of the people in Santa Clara, and how significant that event was for all of us. And mostly because day after, when Fidel spoke in Santa Clara, that was very significant because for black people in my country, we didn't have much hope at all. in many ways. And Santa Clara was segregated for black, for mixed race, and whites. And the rich one side, the black middle class that side. And the only possibility that we have in order to survive and to overcome was to have a radical change in the society. And that radical change, even if I was not part of the struggle as such, but we were involved in such one way or another, but that event was very significant, and I think is valid for me until today.
Let's get the opinion of another Cuban, Emilio, who I've only known about 10 years now, I think. But I think
Only,
we're born
yes.
after the revolution. But what did the revolution mean to you? Born, I think, in Florida, were you?
Indeed, yes. Hello, everyone. And first of all, it's very strange to be talking to you on this camera, sitting here in Miami, where I'm from, but where I don't normally live. I actually live most of the time in London, but I'm here for work and have been doing a lot of work in recent weeks on the 50th anniversary and what it means here. And obviously here, it means something completely different. There's a lot of sort of mixed feelings, depending on what generation of Cubans that are here in Miami have different feelings about the revolution. Obviously, the people like my parents who came here in 1960 have a very strong and very sort of a negative view of the revolution, even though, in my case, my father was very actively involved in Havana in fighting Batista, and in fact spent several years during that later period of Batista's rule living pretty much in hiding because he was a wanted figure by the Batista regime. That's something that I think people often don't know about Miami, which is that there are people here who opposed Fidel Castro, but they didn't necessarily support Batista. That's one thing. I was raised in a very chaotic environment. I was raised in Miami. I was born here. As I've been writing in recent days, I was raised here to think that I was a Cuban. Even though I was born in Miami, I was a Cuban, not only a Cuban, but I was a Cuban exile, and I needed to, from a very young age, was required, like so many of those people in my generation in the 60s, we were required to embrace that idea that they were pursuing. Obviously, as one gets older and begins to, if you're curious, like I am, after all, I am a journalist, you start asking questions and you start wanting to know more, and you start wanting to understand how things could have come to the point that Cuba needed, as Pedro said, a radical change. And he's very right in saying that. So I was raised with the whole idea of the revolution being a very negative and very terrible thing, and that it was time to go back and reclaim it, if you will, and that we needed, but there was also the fascinating aspect of having to live here in Miami, which was then not the city that lies before me now, this gigantic metropolis. It was a very, pretty much a sleepy southern city, and the Cubans changed it significantly, and I was raised in that environment when people, my mom was working full-time, 2 jobs, my father as well, everyone in my family as well, but always hearing about Cuba and that one day we would go back. And to be very honest...
When did you first go to Cuba, and did it surprise you?
Okay. Yes, indeed. Well, I was going to say, I always had this sort of... I was raised to think that Cuba was this... sort of paradise that my family talked about all the time. I mean, I was born in 1964, and so they just spoke about it endlessly at that time. And they always told me, we're going back one day. And I always thought, going back where? Because when you're 4 or 5 years old, you're perfectly happy where you are, as long as you're being loved and you have, a family that cares for you and you're nurtured, you're very happy. So I didn't want to go back anywhere, so to speak. But of course, as I got older and as I became more connected, and I became much more connected to the Afro-Cuban music, to the culture, along the way there once, before going to Cuba, I met Pedro Pérez Ardui here in Miami and interviewed him a very long time ago. And during that whole period, I began to become much more interested in wanting to go to Cuba. And I finally got to go, to answer your question, in 1994, when I was 30 years old. I got to go as a journalist for National Public Radio but I got to visit my family, and I got to write an essay about what it was like, and it was an unbelievable experience to be able to be there, to physically see this place that had been so hugely important in my life, always a part of my life, always a part of everything that I knew as a child, especially. It was an amazing experience to go there and to, of course, put a real context to the reality, to what I heard from my family versus what I saw on the ground there. And it was, there were some major contradictions, obviously.
Well,
but
we'll come on to that in a bit, I'm sure. But
okay.
let's hear about the others. And Richard, I think you first went to Cuba in 1963, I think I've read recently. What were you looking for there? What did you find?
Well, I was amazed by my first trip to Cuba in 1963. First of all, I was really struck by the fact that half the population was black. I had absolutely no idea that half the population of Cuba was black. I thought they were all white revolutionaries. That's what we had been led to believe. The revolution occurred when I was at the university in 1959, and there were two revolutions we followed at that time, the Cuban Revolution and the Algerian Revolution. And I think what was absolutely extraordinary about Cuba was that it was very sort of internationalist from the very beginning. And I just wanted to say, because we're living in the week that we're living in, that 50 years ago, the Cuban Revolution was successful after a couple of years of armed struggle. And 50 years later, the Palestinian people are still engaged in armed struggle as we speak against the brutal and oppressive regime of Israel. Israel, I don't want to mention the word Nazi, but I do think it is a white settler regime, very similar in a curious way to Cuba, to North America, to South America, to South Africa, to Australia, places where the white settlers arrive, take over the country, seize the land, and essentially assassinate the indigenous peoples. And Israel is in that tradition. In the 19th century... No, I think it's perfectly fair in this particular moment to mention this fact. And I think that I welcome the decision yesterday taken by Hugo Chávez to break off relations with Israel, and I wish that Britain would do the same. And I would invite you all, and I will end the commercial here, I would invite you all to join the protest march on the Israeli embassy on Saturday, where they will
take us back to Cuba in 1963.
Now let's go back to Cuba. This is perfectly reasonable, but I want to make my little point. I want to make three essential points about Cuba as a historian, really. First of all, Cuba was traditionally a very, very violent society. 500 years of intervention, of the settlers arriving, of outside invasion, of slave rebellions, of civil wars. And in a curious way, the great achievement of Fidel Castro's revolution in the last 50 years has been to give Cuba a certain degree of peace, something quite unlike what has happened in Latin America during those 50 years, where many, many countries have been under military dictatorship, and they have had exile, torture, people being disappeared, and nobody can produce any evidence that anything like that has happened in Cuba. Cuba is, as people who go there will tell you, is one of the most peaceful countries in the world. So I think it's important to realize that somehow or other Castro has given people this era of peace. My second point really from history is that the Cubans have very ambivalent attitudes towards the United States. The official attitude of Cuba is that we've always been very hostile to American imperialism, but actually if you look back at Cuban history, ever since the 19th century, there has been a very powerful element in Cuban society, particularly among the white elite, who would have liked Cuba to have been like Puerto Rico. They would like Cuba to have become another state of the United States. Even the first generation of independence fighters in the 19th century actually had a meeting where they said, yes, we are fighting for freedom from Spain, and we would like to join the United States. So this element of pro-Americanism in Cuba has always been there, and we should never forget it. I mean, for example, during the first independence war of the 19th century, something like 10% of the population, 100,000 people, left Cuba to go and live in Florida. And they took with them their cigar-making skills and set up cigar factories in Florida. So the relationship between Cuba and the United States goes back a very, very long time, more than a century. And then after independence in 1902, the Americans had marched in 1898 and they left in 1902, and they left an agreement with the Cubans that if there was trouble in Cuba, they, the Americans, would come back. This is usually regarded as, you know, American imperialism, that they kept control over Cuba. But actually, it received the great support of the white elite population of Cuba. And one of the great tragedies of Cuba is that whenever anything happened in Cuba, whenever there was any political argument, sections of the Cuban population would invite the North Americans to come in and give them a helping hand. And that had an effect on the white population, who felt that the Americans would always come to their rescue, because Cuba is still, and always was, a very racist society, and the whites were essentially very, very worried about the blacks. And so when Castro came to power and invited the Communist Party to join him, and the Communist Party had been the only party in Cuba that took an interest in the black population and enrolled them into the black communist unions, the white population was extremely alarmed, and they thought that they could invite the Americans back. And they put pressure on the United States. The United States was nothing loath, but put pressure on the United States to come in. And many of the white Cubans, 60,000, 100,000, left for Miami, thinking that after the Bay of Pig invasion, which they imagined would be successful, that they would return to Cuba. That never happened, because the Cubans rose up and threw out the American invaders, and the people who left for Miami are waiting to this day to return. Now, my last point is that the wonderful thing about Cuba is that it is an absolutely unique experiment. It actually doesn't have all that much to do with socialism. And if it does, it's just as bureaucratic and incompetent and unimaginative as the countries of Eastern Europe were. Cuba is something very, very different. And I think it has two things going for it. It is almost uniquely an egalitarian society. Of course, a minority have access to dollars and have a little bit more money than the others. Yet the nomenclatura in Cuba does not live high on the hog. It is a very, very egalitarian society. Secondly, it is not a consumer society. That is also something that is absolutely extraordinary. There are no shopping malls. There is no advertising. Cubans do not shop to keep the economy going, as we're encouraged to do here. They shop to buy what they need, and plus a little extra when they can. They are adequately fed, quite well educated, well looked after, particularly the children, well dressed, and even beautifully dressed when you see them going out of an evening. There is a downside. The housing is poor.
I think we'll come to the downside.
Transport is poor, and the information is inadequate. And it's a high
let's
price
come to that
to
in a
pay,
minute. Let's hear what
but
Stephen says about his first visit.
support them.
When did you first go to Cuba?
Well, I first got to Cuba in 1986, but I became very interested in Cuba as an undergraduate student of American Studies at Manchester University in 1978. And my adult life has been mainly dedicated, first of all, as an activist in campaigns against the American embargo, or blockade as the Cubans call it, for a very long time. But my first knowledge of Cuba, and I want to relate this from a very personal note because I think it's an interesting anecdote, was when I was 6 years old. I was born in 1956, and my birthday falls in the latter part of October. And my very first birthday party coincided with the moment of the crisis of the missiles. And I remember one Saturday afternoon waiting for the first guests, my first guests to arrive at the house, when the doorbell rang, and I thought it was the first guest. And there were two people standing there, one of whom was a lady dressed in a duffel coat with those toggles on. I remember looking up and seeing this green, and she had a CND badge on. And she said to my mother, who I have to say was a devout Catholic, very conservative, capital C, as well as a small c, and a very, very, very big fan of Kennedy. And these people said to my mother, we're canvassing because, you know, are you aware that the world could end because of Cuba? And I remember them saying this. And I was standing there, and she said, I'll never forget it, she said, don't be silly, Mr. Kennedy would never let the world end because of Cuba. Now go away, you're frightening my child. And she shut the door. And I remember my saying to her, Mummy, is it true that the world will end because of Cuba? And she said...
On my birthday.
She said, no, don't be silly, it's just silly people with their silly politics. No, come on, we're going to have a birthday party. But that stuck in my mind, and I often, when I say it stuck in my mind, it didn't actually recur to me, this episode, until later on when I became utterly fascinated by Cuba. And I wonder whether there was some unconscious thing as a consequence of this experience in my childhood which made me so fascinated by Cuba. But I became fascinated by Cuba principally because A, I became politicized as a student, as a young student in the late 1970s, and B, because I was doing a course in American studies and I actually studied US imperialism. So I'd like to just say that my fascination with Cuba became, from an intellectual point of view, with the idea of Cuba as this microcosm which has many facets to it, which are visited upon many places in the world. And I'd like to, very briefly, it's only a very brief quote.
Sure?
It's only a very brief quote.
Okay.
But this is from a historian, a Cuban-American historian called Lou Perez, who published a book only last year. This book is called Cuba and the American Imagination. Now, Lou Perez is not, is resident in the United States, and is not considered to be a Cuban historian, but an American historian. And this is from the introduction of his book, and this is the principal reason why I became interested in Cuba in the first place. Cuba, I mean, he says this better than I can. Cuba occupies a special place in the history of American imperialism. It has served as something of a laboratory for the development of the methods by which the United States has pursued the creation of a global empire. In the aggregate, the means used by the United States constitute a microcosm of the American imperial experience. Armed intervention and military occupation, nation building and constitution writing, capital penetration and cultural saturation, the installation of puppet regimes, the formation of clientele political classes, and the organization of proxy armies, the imposition of binding treaties, the establishment of permanent military bases, economic assistance or not, and diplomatic recognition or not, as circumstances warranted. And after 1959, trade sanctions, political isolation, covert operations, and an economic embargo. All that is American imperialism has been practiced in Cuba.
We have immediately, we're not going to go through the 50 years of the revolution, I think, but we've immediately got to this point of relations with the United States. And Richard, in his recent article in The Guardian, said that the main achievement of the Cuban Revolution is to have survived this long. And I wondered whether you thought the revolution has survived because of the United States hostility or despite United States hostility. I wonder what Emilio thinks about that. Is it because of the stance of the United States that Fidel and the revolution have survived, or is it despite all the efforts of the United States?
I think it's a little bit of both, probably. I think the United States hasn't seemed to have found a reason to reverse the embargo. They haven't noticed that it didn't work in all this time, and they, of course, they had help from the Cuban community here in Miami, the exiled community, especially the more right-wing elements, which really have been pushing for that to remain in place. What is interesting is that the latest poll conducted by Florida International University here in Miami of the Cuban community found for the first time that people in Miami, Cubans in Miami, the majority don't support the embargo any longer. That's a generational shift, and that also has a lot to do with the more recent arrivals, which are tens of thousands of people who have really got a very different relationship with Cuba. They grew up within the revolution. But going back to your point, indeed, the embargo may have helped to perpetuate the revolution, or you could see it the other way, despite the embargo. There's a little bit of both in that, in my view.
Pedro, what do you think? Do you consider that the embargo and the attitude of the United States, because of its hostility, has that somehow given the revolution a chance to continue, to define itself against that?
I think that Cubans in the island didn't have another option rather than to make that revolution to succeed one way or another. The struggle of Cuba dated back to even the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And then 1770, it was one of the first slave riots in the eastern part of Cuba. History is there. And then we cannot really forget that when Fidel attacked the Moncada in 1953, it was 100 years since a very insignificant event happened. In Cuba, because it was 1953, 1853, the struggle 1868. It was a kind of cycle, as if that generation that Fidel led, and I remember that he said, if we were like them, it wouldn't be, and they will be like us in 1953. So it had been a kind of continuation of the struggle in Cuba. It happened by destiny, fate, I don't know what, perhaps that dove that went into Fidel Castro, that he was the man that led the struggle. So for us in Cuba at the time, we were not thinking in 100% in our relationship with the United States, that date back to 1815, when John Quincy Adams wanted to have Cuba the same way that they had Puerto Rico right now. So to me, perhaps the US-Cuba relationship, which is a kind of syndrome, is one kind of a love and hate relationship. Cuba is a kind of, not necessarily consumer mind society, but Cuba is very ingrained into the American way of life, not into Spanish way of life, or British way of life, or Argentinian way of life. The Cuban mind, the Cuban psyche is ingrained into made in USA. And so always have to be like that. We have to deal with the United States. We have to deal with America one way or another. So I believe that it really pushed, because when Fidel went to the United Nations in 1960, and he met with Nixon and over there, he didn't go to America just to say, here I am a communist, because he was not as such a communist or a socialist, right? But he wanted just to say, let's going to talk to you and let's make peace and let's going to work together. So Nixon saw something wrong and the history is there. So I believe that one way or another, we would be where we are right now in 2010, 2009, on an easy path, easy way, but still we were here.
And what, Richard, you were the one who mentioned survival. What do you think, that it's because or in spite of the United States?
Oh, I think it's in spite of the United States. I think the embargo has been quite useful for the Cuban government. I don't think it's had all that much effect. They've been able to move around it and to trade with other countries. But I think the embargo is very useful as sort of to give an idea that the United States is still very hostile, still a menace, And I think that is quite, I think the Cuban population like to hear that. They regard the United States, they've been persuaded that it is the enemy. So I think it's been useful for the regime, but I don't think it's been at all an essential part of keeping the regime going.
And we're talking about the regime and the survival of the regime, and as Pedro's been saying, you can't talk about that without talking about Fidel. Is Fidel the revolution?
Can I go back to the previous question?
All right, start there again.
I don't want to duck it. I can come back to that. But
Okay.
I mean, I think that the story is a complex one, and it's an interesting one from the point of view of saying, well, you know, the embargo is a policy, but it's not the only policy the United States has had against Cuba. When one's talking about the attitude of the United States towards Cuba, one would have to say that, to a great extent, of course, the revolution was an affirmation. Really, its raison d'etre was the affirmation and the establishment of true sovereignty and independence of the country, which was actually usurped by the United States in 1902. So the point is that what Castro represents is really the first establishment of a truly independent Cuban republic, which had been an ambition that goes back to the 19th century. So we're talking about exactly a cycle and a continuum of history, within which this revolution falls. Now, the point is that the United States took some seriously erroneous decisions. I mean, I would have to say that they very early took the decision, the Eisenhower administration, it's now been revealed, the secret documents have been made public, that they took a very early decision to get rid of Castro. They decided they were going to get rid of him, but it would be done, as they say in the quotes, the hidden hand. We're going to do it surreptitiously if we can, but that's our intention. And so they presented a front diplomatically, which still allows historians to claim that the United States was trying to make peace with Castro, ostensibly, but secretly they were actually managing things to undermine him. And this is actually before the full embargo is imposed. But of course, the reaction of the Cubans is to say, this actually helped, in a sense, Castro to consolidate the revolution. And in fact, if one is to say, okay, there is a debate about whether he was a communist in 1959 or not, etc., etc., but the revolution wasn't declared communist until April the 15th, 1961, and he takes this opportunity to do this when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. So in other words, the United States handed on a plate to Castro the moment with which he could actually radicalize the revolution and take it further leftwards. So in other words, the United States actually has been, to some extent, in my opinion, had a role to play in actually producing this radicalized revolution and this problem that they've created for themselves. In other words, they have in some senses created the monster. Now there is a point. I mean, there was a point when the British were actually trying to convince the Americans that it wasn't a good idea to treat Castro this way. And actually, it's been revealed that Allen Dulles, as head of the CIA, said no. He said to Macmillan, Macmillan said to Allen Dulles, well, you do realize that what you're doing will drive Castro into the arms of the Soviets. And quite candidly, Dulles said, and it's minuted, and you can look it up, Dulles said, well, that's exactly what we want. We want an excuse to invade them, basically. So in other words, the United States policy actually led to this in some respects. Now, is Castro the revolution? Well, I don't subscribe to that. I know you don't, Richard, because it's in your book. And I really take this opportunity to plug Richard's book to anybody who wants to read a history of Cuba.
All his books, yeah.
But is Castro the revolution? To some extent, he has unfortunately embodied this leadership role to such an extent that it becomes very difficult for people to imagine a Cuba without him. And I think that is something that probably preoccupies the minds of Cubans somewhat as much as it preoccupies those outside. And there certainly is an obsession in the media in the West about this. My feeling is that the tradition of the revolution, the institutions that the revolution has created, and the good fortune that Fidel Castro has of having a junior brother to take over from him in an interim period will mean that this revolution will outlast him, and I think will outlast him for a long time to come. I don't want to go any further because it probably
Emilio, I'm sure that when Fidel was taken so ill in 2006, most of the Cubans in Miami thought that was it. That was the end of the revolution. How are they coming to terms with the fact that it isn't?
Sorry about that, Nick. They sure did. I was here, in fact. That was the first time I had come back here in 14, 15 years to work, and I happened to be here on that day when that announcement came on Cuban television. And about a half an hour later, I was standing outside the Versailles restaurant in Little Havana with a microphone recording this kind of madness, as people just, celebrating what they imagined would be the end of the communism in Cuba. Fidel dying would mean the end of communism in Cuba. They were certain that he was dead. They were certain that if people were making that kind of a statement on Cuban television, that he was probably already dead, and they were just preparing people for that. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the way, the secrecy with which the Cuban media operates and covers official matters. So there is a bit of blame on that side. But it was an amazing outpouring of jubilation, if you will, which now has muted incredibly, having come back recently here, and it's muted. There's a different feeling. There's a lot of sort of nuance now to the discussion because Raul Castro is in power, because now we saw that Cuba did have a very strong that revolution and that Communist Party has a very strong infrastructure, that there's a depth to it. This is not a banana republic where the dictator dies and then he gets, a new system or a new regime comes back in. That's not what Cuba's about. It's a much more complex situation, perhaps similar to a lot of Eastern European countries, and not at the same time. Some kind of event could make some kind of change happen, but I think all those people who are involved in the revolution, who are part of that system, would need to be in some kind of position to secure themselves of some kind of position before this idea of a major sweeping change coming to Cuba. I don't think that's the case, but I do think, having heard some of the things that Richard said and others, I do think that Cuba does carry what I kept thinking when he was speaking was, Cuba has been placed internationally, this heavy burden has been placed on the Cuban people, that they're the experiment, they're the ones that managed to survive all this time. Well, that's great, but there has been a price to pay along the way. I'm not rabid, so I don't have any kind of rabid views, and I'm a very fair-minded journalist, but I do think that we need to take a closer look and not just sort of say, what a great thing it was. It was a great thing when it happened. People brought it in to support, but there's a lot of questions to be asked about. Is it right for Fidel to transfer power just to Raul officially?
Okay.
Is that really the way to do it?
I want to ask Richard that question more or less. Fidel may or may not be the revolution, but it's often said proudly by a lot of people he's seen off 10 American presidents. But you could turn that around and say, why did he hang on to power for 48 years? Why was that necessary as part of the revolution?
Fidel Castro is undoubtedly one of the great figures of the 20th century, like anywhere, not just in Latin America. And it's very difficult with somebody who's brought up on the left, because on the whole, if you're on the left, you don't believe in great men. We think it's historical forces, but somehow if you're presented with a figure like Fidel, you realize that he is a very, very unusual, head and shoulders above everybody else in his society. I think in some ways if Fidel had died on day one, the revolution would still have rolled on. It would have rolled on in a different way, but it still would have happened. But the fact that you have these extraordinary figures, it's quite odd, because in Latin America in general, there aren't sort of tremendous figures. You can think of sort of half a dozen perhaps in the last century. And in Western Europe today, I can't think of a single, charismatic, interesting politician who one would wish to subscribe to his ideas. So this is quite a sort of strange phenomenon. I can't think in my life as a sort of 50 years as a journalist of the presidents and leaders I have met. I can't think of anybody apart from Fidel, Olof Palme, Julius Nyerere. That's about it. 2 or 3, really, really great figures, intelligent, intellectual, impressive figures. So, what can we say about Fidel? That he's held on power for so long. But then if you are a super efficient, interesting guy who stands head and shoulders above everybody else in your society, it is quite difficult to withdraw and say, I'm going to go and live on my farm, which is what Julius Nyerere, to his credit, did.
But you were saying how egalitarian the Cuban Revolution was. Surely
I don't think
the thing of producing a revolution, of empowering everybody, means that you realize that you're not that indispensable and that you can retire and leave it to the people.
I don't think that's got anything to do with egalitarianism. I mean, I think we could say, wouldn't it be nice if Fidel had thrown in the sponge some years ago? But if you're the sort of leader of the nation, and the nation obviously likes you, it's very difficult to throw in the sponge.
Yeah, but Fidel in two occasions, in more than one occasion, even in Santa Clara, sorry, 50 years ago, he said that even myself, he was talking about he himself, Fidel Castro, I am not unimportant as you. So he was demanded one way or another empower the people, not the public, the people with such a power that we, because I was there at the time, didn't have before that. And he comes through a tradition which is the tradition of the greatest warrior in the case of Cuba and Central America, Latin America, South America, Bolivar, O'Higgins, San Martin. All these people were, as we said in Spanish, fuera de serie. I mean, they were people out of that world. I mean, they were people with a different kind of frame, like José Martí, a poet, a writer, a man that created what Fidel embodied himself in order to attack the Moncada, a man who was very anti-imperialist, who oversaw what the United States was about to do with Central, South America, the Caribbean, in many ways. So he comes from that generation, not me. I was born in 1943. I'm saying the way he came to power, and he said to the population, read and find out your own history, because we didn't know anything about before for many people in the country. So the way, to me, that the Cuban people, the 6.5 million Cubans in the country, in the island at the time, were one way or another empowered with culture, reading to find out what was all about. And I believe that I think that was one of the reasons why the United States was so hasty in order just to eliminate Fidel Castro, because they knew who that man was all about. It was not just imposing any authoritarian behavior or attitude toward the people. He was opening schools. I mean, I was the first one in a very extended family. 13 brothers on the side of my father, 13 brothers and sisters on the side of my mother, all of them almost illiterate, to being able to say, wow, I could go into higher education in 1959. And I'm talking about working class people.
Stephen?
Well, I mean, I would say that, you see, one of the unique things about Cuba, and again, going back to Richard's point about the uniqueness of the country, is the way in which Fidel Castro had this dialogue with the people. I mean, we are used to the fact that he speaks for a long time, but he would gather people.
Well, what gets me is he speaks for 5 hours and nobody interrupts him. That's what
That's not strictly speaking true.
No.
That is not strictly speaking true. In fact, there are, if you read the speeches, you will find that there are many occasions in which there is an interchange. But the point is that he was able to gather not just a couple of 100,000 people, but 1.5 million people in one place. Talk to them for 4 hours. Now, I don't think that is a feat that could be repeated in history. I'm not sure even now that it can be done. And so this is a phenomenon. This is a phenomenon. And so you have to say that he's also somebody who has an enormous capacity of charm. I mean, the man invited the Pope to the country. I mean, this Polish Pope. I mean, this is a feat of diplomacy which is unequaled. You have to say that this guy has got to be a great statesman. Now, what people with a leader like that is going to choose to get rid of him? And so, you know, he is reaffirmed many times. And of course, there is also those people who study the history of the revolution will know that there was a period when Fidel Castro was actually marginalized within the leadership, and there was a faction that was very much akin to the Soviet Union Communist Party that actually really ran things for quite a long time. And Castro made a return in the 1980s, a very big return in the 1980s, by appealing over the heads of the bureaucrats to the masses once again, and bringing back the masses into the process. So you see, there is this relationship between the leader and the masses. There is leadership and there is voluntary followership in Cuba, and this is a phenomenon that people have to recognize if they're going to understand exactly what it is and understand exactly how it survived so long. Because indeed, it is unquestionable that he is an extremely popular man. And I would finish by just adding a note which that has to be taken into account as well, that unlike the Soviet Union, for example, Fidel Castro did have an escape valve. Those who didn't like what was going on in the island were able to leave, and they did, and they are living in Florida. So in other words, what you have in Cuba is a kind of internationalized class conflict. The bourgeoisie weren't slaughtered, they weren't sent to the gulag, they weren't eliminated, they emigrated, and they're living in Florida. And you have had a conflict across the Florida Straits over the last 50 years, which is really an internationalized class conflict. And it's the bourgeois class of Cuba that wishes to return. And these are the people that have driven American policy over the last 15 years. Thankfully, as a consequence of working class Cubans now migrating to Florida and becoming a larger minority within the Florida community, the grip of that clique in Florida on electoral politics has been weakened. And that is a reflection of a class division which is now being exported from Cuba to Florida.
And isn't that also a reflection of some of the potential failures of the revolution, that working class in Cuba, that if the revolution were as much of a panacea as you make it sound, that those people shouldn't have to be here?
Ah, well, that's another interesting point, isn't it? Because, of course, it wasn't so much the failure of Cuba that resulted in the conditions which meant that people wanted to leave and go to Florida, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, which wasn't really Cuba's fault. And of course, Fidel Castro had the prescience to say to the Cuban people in 1988, if one day we wake up and find the Soviet Union is not there any longer, we will continue our socialist path. He actually had a premonition, or he knew what was happening.
There's a big debate, as you said, of whether it's socialist or not. But I can sense that there's quite a lot of people who would like to ask questions in the audience here. I've just got two more questions before we open it out. And the first is that this is the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. Do you think that the people in 1959 would recognize what is in Cuba now? Is it in any way reflect what they were out to achieve then? Would they recognize it? Richard, what do you think?
Yes, I think they would, because in an extraordinary way, as I've written somewhere, Cuba is an island that is preserved in aspic. To me, if I return to Cuba, it's exactly like how I remember it in the early 1960s. So physically, the island is exactly the same. Whether they would recognize what they hoped to get 50 years ago is a totally other question, and I slightly doubt it.
I don't know what you say to that.
No, you have to rephrase that question. You have to rephrase it. Because nothing could be what should have to be at some point in time. In 1959, I didn't know what the future would be. And then a lot of events happened all along. I remember the missile crisis. I was studying at the Havana Hilton. It was Havana Libre at the time, 1962, and I have to be mobilized as a miliciano, 1961, again, the Bay of Pigs. So Cuba have gone through, and this is very important in order to praise that people over there in Cuba, not me who live in London since 1981, but my family who live down there. And it's the way that the Cubans in the island have managed to survive different waves of annihilation, one after another. It's amazing to read what happened during the latest 3 hurricanes. And for any of you who know the Caribbean, who know what a hurricane is all about, I mean, that island we call Cuba es como el corcho. I mean, we float. You know the cork? Always. I mean, it's impossible just to press a cork because the island just blew it again. So the people are still surviving. And there is another saying, we Cubans say that in Cuba, like Cuba is like the cucaracha. the cockroach, which is impossible to annihilate in one way or another. So that's, if the people have managed just to survive and managed just to get right now 4.5, 4.6 infant mortality rates in that island in Cuba, where things disappear just if they have a wind. Anyway, so what I mean is that I don't know if Cuba would be the same. I know Puerto Rico because I live in Puerto Rico, and I believe that the Cubans maybe would like to be like Puerto Rico, but the Puerto Rican really would like to be like Cubans because they say, please don't try this again. I mean, landing in San Juan, you think that you're landing in Los Angeles. It's amazing.
And I suppose the last question, maybe we can start with Emilio, is that now is a time of change in the United States as well, with Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States. Can you see a change in relations between the United States and Cuba now with a new president there?
Well, given a couple of factors, the fact that what we spoke about earlier, the fact that there's been a shift here, the younger people, those born here like myself, the new generation of people coming over, that shift here, that lack of support or the faltering support for the hard line, combined with the fact that Barack Obama doesn't have an electoral debt, if you will, to the Cuban exile community, even though he did court them in his own way, and he did sort of put certain buffers into what he would or wouldn't do. I don't expect him to come in and lift the embargo. That's not going to happen, but he's certainly already made it clear, and through those who are advising him on Latin America, that he's going to come in and at the very least take away the severe restrictions that were imposed in 2004 by President Bush, and perhaps bring Cuba back to, at the very least, the Clinton era, where travel was at least allowed more frequently, and the sending of money was allowed for people here. That kind of thing will happen, I think, rather quickly. But I think there's something deeper that could indeed happen. And of course, Raul Castro has made comments recently indicating that he's willing to negotiate or talk at some level. He's made it quite clear he's not going to negotiate a lot, and he's not going to sort of put a lot on the table, but he's certainly welcomed the idea of going to a table and talking. So that's certainly a step forward as well on that side.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, you have to look very carefully at the language. Sovereignty and independence is the bottom line. The Cubans will not sacrifice or compromise anything on that basis. So Raul Castro has said, I'll talk to you, but it's got to be on the basis of equals. Now, you're talking about the former colonial power, which has refused to accept this government for 50 years, suddenly deciding that they're going to treat it in a different way. Now, can that be possible? Is it possible for Barack Obama to use a language that will allow the Cubans to come to the table? I think it's very difficult to imagine. However, there are things that are happening within the United States which would allow for some relaxation. And I think there is going to be a decompression, a intensification of the relationship. I think Obama will bring about some changes. I agree with Emilio that we can't expect him to lift the embargo, and he certainly can't use language which would appear to allow the Cubans to think that they've won. That's very briefly. We could talk about it more later.
Sure.
But maybe let other people.
I'd like to change the question slightly for you two. It's a question that's been asked of Britain, but you've talked of egalitarianism. Can you see a black president in Cuba? As you said, all the revolutionaries were very, very white. The population of Cuba now is probably more than half black. Can you see a black president in Cuba?
Well, they had a black president before Fidel. Batista was black. So they've already done that. So I see no reason why that shouldn't happen again.
Not even himself believe it.
But just on the Barack Obama front, I think I'm prepared to be optimistic until January the 20th. And I think that Barack Obama, it's totally disastrous for him, the world scene, the economic scene, the Palestine scene. There is absolutely nowhere that he can make any move But the place where he needs to do something is Latin America, where everything's been totally neglected for the last decade. And for Barack Obama, Cuba is an absolutely win-win solution. He has should be no problems for an American president to, after 50 years, to make a deal with Cuba. And in my imagination, I can imagine Barack Obama going to Cuba and being greeted with huge enthusiasm by the Cuban people, just as the Pope went there. Jimmy Carter went there after he was president and made a speech that was carried on television. And there is absolutely no reason at all, apart from the blindness of the American elite, to Barack Obama making a big change that would really change not only relationships with Cuba, with Latin America as well.
Pedro, we started with you, we finished with you. Can you see a new era in US-Cuba politics?
Oh, definitely, definitely. The Americans, no, the Cuban American, the Americans, no, neither the Native American, that population, those who rule the power, those who got the money, those who own the businesses in America, those people want to do business with Cuba. We are very close. I remember my last trip, Emilio, to Florida was in November, and it takes longer from Gainesville, where I was, the scholarship once, to Miami, rather than from Havana to Miami. So we are so close that it's amazing how these two countries, this little island 90 miles away from Key West, wouldn't do business with Cuba. And don't think about that the two countries, the two populations are eager to confront again. No, they, one way or another, and I found that talking to the people and being around in America in different universities for many years, that enough is enough. And this man, Obama, which is going to be president in a few days, is the best thing that could happen to America. Honestly, not because he's black, and I wouldn't like him because he's black. It's because the man is intelligente, he's brilliant, he is out of question. This is a super kind of person. And the Americans have to be very proud to have this man over there in power right now. And I believe that, wait and see.
Okay. I'd like to throw it open to you now. I think Deborah's got a microphone. It'd be nice if you, A, if you identified yourself, and B, if you asked specific questions rather than state your ideological position.
Can you just check you're not sitting on a microphone? I think one of you might be sitting on a microphone.
I think it's Emilio's camera.
Oh, fine.
So,
Wow, there's loads of you.
well, let's start at the back, actually, and then we'll work forward. And yes, it's good to have a woman speak. I'm sorry that we're such a male presence up here. That wasn't intentional at all, I'm sure you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, but I'll just put one initially. The Pen Club, the International Pen Club, has indicted censorship in Cuba. Someone I know in the Cuban government has said that there's a lot of misguided information, disinformation, if you like, in the Western press, as we all know. I wonder if the panel could comment on the situation of writers as an example.
You didn't identify yourself. Are you from Penn?
No.
Uh-huh.
No, not at all.
Okay.
My name is Sandra Satterley. I'm a journalist, freelance, but mainly with Guardian Weekly.
Okay.
So if the panel could comment on that issue, I'd be very grateful.
Of censorship, freedom of the press in Cuba and the situation, briefly, I think. Who wants to start? Steve.
Briefly, there is a campaign in the world. There is a campaign around what people are called independent journalists in Cuba. Now, independent journalists in Cuba are people who do not work for the state-owned media. The first point is to say that, of course, Cuba is a single-party state, it's a socialist country, and the media is state-owned. If you don't work for the state media, you can become a, quote, independent journalist. But where do the independent journalists publish? They mainly publish on websites which are cited in Florida. And what happens to these people is that they, for some reason or another, get drawn into accepting and being supported by funds that emanate from the United States. And in the context of the confrontation between the United States and the Cuban state, this is seen as an act of subversion by the Cuban state. And the independent journalists who are in jail in Cuba, and it's undoubtedly the fact that they are in jail in Cuba, are people who were not convicted for what they wrote, but for what they did, which was to accept payment from the United States for their work. And this is the point of difference between the Cuban government and Pen Club. The Cuban government views these individuals as people who are mercenaries for an enemy state, and therefore are subject to the laws of the country. The laws under which they were imprisoned were brought in after the passage of the Helms-Burton Law of 1996, which allows US government funding to fund independent journalists inside Cuba. So it was a government response to an act by the United States. That is the factual context in which this takes place. I can assure you that is the fact. Those are the facts.
Somebody wanted to come back on that, I think. Is that what you wanted to comment on?
Could I add something, or?
Sorry, Emilio wants to come in. Come in, Emilio.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can't beat around the bush. The fact of the matter is, yes, indeed, we all know that the United States has made, we've talked about it endlessly, the blunders, the political blunders, the fact that the way that they're trying to exert some kind of power in Cuba, a lot of those things are wrong. But the fact of the matter is that there is censorship in Cuba. That sentence is true. There is censorship in Cuba, and people cannot necessarily tell you openly what they think, and especially not write it down. And the state owns the media, as Steve said, and that perhaps needs to change. I mean, Hugo Chávez has managed in Venezuela, despite whatever the opposition may say, he has allowed an opposition media to exist there. That sends a signal to the world that he's not out to create a hegemonic control of power. What is Cuba afraid of if everyone is okay with things? Why isn't it possible for people to speak their mind? And why do people, this idea, this political rhetoric of referring to them as mercenaries, certainly probably some of them are perhaps mercenaries, but that just is a way to tag anyone who has a view. And they do the same thing here in Miami on the other side. So there's this kind of intensity that needs to be brought down, in my view.
Yeah.
I think that, if you don't mind, there's a lot more questions we need to get through, I think. The gentleman in glasses there. What was the question?
Thank you. My name is Tom Oliver, and I don't represent anybody. I'm interested in the panel's view as to what there is in this for the Cuban people, for there to be greater contact in the long term with America. It seems to me that despite the reservations that you have about the Cuban state, and you're clear about those, there's an awful lot to be said for being a Cuban at the moment. And I'm interested to know what you see it's in for ordinary Cubans, of there being a lot of import of American capital and the kind of get-rich-quick life which goes on across the water.
Richard, you were the one who stressed that Cubans aren't consumers, they're not part of the consumer world, and what do you see them as gaining with closer contact with the United States?
Well, the difficulty is they aren't part of the consumer world, but an awful lot of them would like to be, and that is absolutely fundamental. I mean, it's very curious about Cuba and sort of freedom of speech, because actually Cubans themselves will talk to you very freely. They're not really frightened of the secret police, or I totally agree about the lack of freedom of the press, but in fact freedom of speech in terms of what goes on in the street is perfectly okay. I think they would like to be to have more consumer goods. I think all that sort of thing. They are very, very aware of what happens outside Cuba. One of the great tragedies of Cuba is that they don't compare themselves with Caribbean islands or with Central America or all the poverty-stricken places with which they are surrounded. They only really, for historical reasons, compare themselves with the United States and the standard of living that the United States has. So I think that they would like to, I think it would be fair to say that most Cubans would quite like to have something that more resembles a consumer society. And in a funny way, because you now have a very, very well-educated population, I sometimes think the situation is a bit like Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, when the revolution drifted away and then big capital came in and took advantage of this educated population. So there is a sort of danger that that could happen to Cuba. I think the Cubans have been very, very much inoculated by what happened in Eastern Europe. They know about what happened in Eastern Europe. They don't like what they hear and what they see. So I don't think that they're going to embrace outside capital with any great enthusiasm. But I do perceive that they will almost certainly in the next decade or so move towards some sort of internal capitalism that will make their life perhaps a little easier.
Can we have another, right at the back, another question?
Yeah, I'd just like to question whether... sorry, my name is Keith Raffan. Question whether Barack Obama is likely to do anything about Cuba in his first term. His in-tray is so full with the economic situation, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia now with the gas supplies. And also because although he's run an efficient transition, it's widely regarded, certainly by liberal Democrats, as a cautious and conservative one. And he's been very conservative in his views and expression of views on the international situation. And particularly, of course, because he is a Chicago politician, we can't forget that. And he wants to keep Florida in the Democratic column. And, of course, Jeb Bush is almost certain to run for the Senate in 2010. And unlike his brother, he's very popular in Florida, the former governor, and is married to a Hispanic. So isn't he likely to be very, very cautious, as I think Stephen expressed, in actually doing much about Cuba?
Emilio,
well, yes,
would you like to answer that?
Sure, I could jump in. I mean, I think what I said earlier. I mean, he's one thing about Barack Obama. We talk about his sort of abilities as an orator, his incredible sort of political presence. But there is something about him, another side to him, which he keeps showing as well. If one notices, is that he starts on a very grand scale, but then he starts sort of putting things into just sort of containing it. And I get the feeling that with Cuba, yes, he's probably not just going to, like I said earlier, he's not going to come in and lift the embargo with a magic wand, but he certainly, he will look at ways to make changes. He's very pragmatic, I think, and he's not perhaps as idealistic as some people might hope. I think he's much more going to be somebody who follows the line, if you will, and deviates from it in bits and pieces, and I don't think we can expect monumental change, but hey, maybe I'll be proven wrong as well, okay. So who knows.
Another question? There, yeah, hello there.
Hello, my name's Lydia. I just in terms of standard of living, I was just curious to know if, Pedro, you've lived in Puerto Rico, that in Cuba, I think it's, I'm not quite sure, something like $10 to $15 a month that most people live on. What is it in Puerto Rico? Just, it might be an interesting comparison.
Does anybody know?
Do you know?
Well, no, it's totally different.
It's much higher than that.
There's no way to, it's very high, but it's impossible to compare Cuba to Puerto Rico.
Just in terms of income?
Right, if you make about, when I used to live in Cuba in the 60s and the 70s, I was making 231 Cuban pesos as a journalist. I used to work for radio. And that was enough for me, for my family. Why? Because the housing belongs to me. The electricity I pay was cents, 65 cents. The gallon of petrol, what we call gasolina in Cuba, was 65 cents. So it's incomparable. And then don't think away. Don't think Cuba don't pay taxes. Everything is subsidized one way or another. So I believe that Raul Castro will have to come to terms with that kind of gratuity, the way he calls it right now, in Cuba, because life has been in such a way, Cubans in the island have been used to, not necessarily to spend money except imparting food and clothing. But nothing. We don't pay dentistry. We don't pay. They don't pay dentists. They don't pay her. They don't pay even school books.
Have the question here then. You've been waiting some time.
Clothing, sport.
My name is Carlos. I'm Cuban. I just came back from the island after being out for 8 years, and I just answering the question someone asked already. Right now, the gasoline, a liter of gasoline is 1 Cuban peso. convertible that is 120 in American dollar, as the dollar have a hefty tax by the government on it. So every time that you try to change a dollar, you only receive 80 CUC or Cuban convertible pesos. A lot of goods, basic stuff goods, mops, scrubs, toothpaste. The only way that you can actually get it now is in dollar shops. A salary on a normal patient of a normal person in Cuba go from $15 to $25 a month. The cost of living, the cost of living right now, it would be 125 pesos a month, convertible pesos.
Do you have a question though? For
That's no, just answering this question.
All right. Jimmy, you wanted a question at the back. The back.
Jimmy Burns. I haven't sort of got a sort of very clear idea from listening to the panel. I wonder if this question could be addressed by Emilio and Richard, because in a sense they're coming on the subject from very different ideological perspectives, which is, you know, in terms of political prophecy and possibilities, what kind of political structures could we see emerging in a post-Castro Cuba with an Obama president? I mean, the nearest kind of parallel I can think of a long enduring leader, charismatic, if you put it that way, Richard, or dictatorial, some of his opponents would put it, is General Franco in Spain. What we saw there was a transition period, but based on political structures which were fairly well established in opposition. I'm talking about the Communist Party, I'm talking about the Socialist Party, both in exile and within the trade unions, within journalists, within business. I'm just wondering whether the panel, and particularly Emilio and Richard, think that the lack of that kind of structured opposition that one finds in Cuba, particularly in the trade union movement, all right, we talked about independent journalists, there's a question mark about them, a lack of an opposition party emerging from the Miami exiles, or indeed structured political thought emerging from the exile community, is a real downer in terms of the future of Cuba.
Yeah? Can you...
I don't know, people are always so enthusiastic about opposition parties. I hold no brief for opposition parties in the political systems of the West.
But the opposition party can then become the government, surely that's the point.
Well, that's the point, but does it make a blind bit of difference? So that's the point, my point. I think I don't think Cuba is going to go down the Franco-Spain road. I think you're absolutely right about that. I think the closest parallel I can think of is that of Turkey. That Ataturk had an extraordinary revolution. He died after about 20 years at the end of the 1930s, and his revolution is still very much alive in Turkey today, though is now very much under attack. And I would perceive Cuba soldiering on into the distant future without very, very significant change. I don't see it myself.
Emilio, do you think that there are coherent political structures that can fill the post-Castro vacuum?
Well, first of all, I'd like to take issue with this idea that I was somehow drastically ideologically opposed to Richard or something. so you know, I don't know where I'm being framed here, but be careful with that, please. But I would like to say that I think there is a role. There should be some kind of role in some. But with Cuba deciding first, I think most people here in Miami now, especially the majority, I think, of people here of the Cuban community, don't necessarily think it's their role to go in and take over Cuba. There are those, of course, who still sort of have those illusions, if you will. But I think there should be, there's been a lot accomplished by the Cubans here beyond the politics on the economic level, a lot of know-how, technology, things of that sort, that within the right framework, they should probably have some kind of a role in a future where Cuba and the U.S. have better ties and where they're able to go back and somehow some of them integrate into the society. I don't think you'd ever find a huge return migration Cubans either, because many of them are now here, you know, they've got 3 generations here in the United States. But I do think some kind of transition in the future, perhaps something of the Spanish model, perhaps, where you don't continue to dwell on the horrors of the past, but at the same time, the horrors of the past are there for both sides, so they need to be addressed. I think there will be some kind of a role, I think, is what I would like to say, and I think we need to wait and see what happens in the next few months once Mr. Obama takes over and power and really starts acting out on his foreign policy, not just talking about it, but really laying it out before us.
Yeah. Another question? Yeah, in the middle, you've been patient there.
Hi, my name's Andrew Lang. I spent a year living in Cuba making a film which was broadcast on PBS and Arte, working through the EKIC. I think we haven't really addressed in this discussion what people in Cuba right now feel about the situation in their country. We've talked a lot about the history and the glory days of the revolution right at the beginning, but I would say, having lived in Cuba for a year, that the majority of the young people, especially those under 40, are profoundly disenfranchised and disconnected from the government. If you listen to the rhetoric of Castro's speeches, it started off as sort of building this socialist utopia in the Caribbean, and it's now, or in recent years, it's just all been about sort of heroic resistance. Young people aren't interested in heroic resistance. They want to be able to make their own lives. They're not interested in sacrificing their whole lives like their parents have for nothing. And you know, the mood recently in Cuba after 2 hurricanes and the economic crisis is really low. And I don't have a question, but I think it's an important point.
The question is, can the revolution that's lasted 50 years, can it still engage a new generation of 25-year-olds like the people who came to power in 1959? If we could have a brief answer, what do you think?
Well, I don't know what basis you have for making this assumption apart from a subjective experience of talking to a few Cubans.
But he's lived there for a year and made a film.
Well, so I've been visiting the island since 1986, and I've spent extended periods of time living there as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that one of the reasons why we founded the Institute for the Study of Cuba at London Metropolitan is to get to some kind of objective and clear understanding of exactly what's going on. This is a very often repeated comment that you've made, but the counter-evidence to it is stark, because there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that you can visibly see that the mass of Cuban youth is disillusioned. In fact, to some extent, there are facts which you can cite to counter those arguments. For example, membership of the Young Communist Party has increased over the last 5 years. Oh, these are just the facts. I'm not defending the system. I'm saying that there is some, obviously, if there was this amount of disaffection, it would be evident in some way. And clearly, apart from people coming back saying, I've spoken to some people in Havana and they're not very happy, there isn't any.
Well, and this, I can see us getting into
it. Let me finish.
Yeah, just finish.
Let me just finish. I would say that the proof of the argument will be only borne out in time. I think we have to wait and see. And it goes back to the point that you were making about, and the gentleman at the back was making, about what is likely to happen. Unfortunately, with Cuba, we've been in this position before. In 1990, I think it was, when Ceausescu fell, my former employers at The Guardian, and incidentally I used to work on the weekly, and I've edited your copy, Gott, Richard, which I have to say, but I have to say that, I wrote to my former editors to say, look, you've got it wrong. They published an article saying after Ceausescu, Fidel Castro's got 6 months. And this sort of comment I hear now is exactly the same sort of thing, is that repeatedly the cork has bobbed back up again, quite surprisingly, against all of these perceived ideas. Now, we are seriously about saying, look, this is a very interesting, you call it an experiment. We prefer to call it an experience. Cuba is a microcosm of many things, and it is a very interesting place to study from the point of view that you're making, that it does defy sometimes some of the reactions that we get, which are really quite superficial. And we are victims very much of misinformation, I have to say. Some of these ideas are fed through a constant barrage, and we have to be very careful about what we assume to be the case.
Steve, can I say something?
I've tried to stay neutral.
I just want to stay a point, though.
But I must say that all my experience of visiting Cuba, the young people have constantly expressed dissatisfaction. The fact that they would love to be leaving the island, be able to travel freely, be able to buy clothes, be able to to earn money in a meaningful way. So I think that to dismiss it as a subjective and as misinformation, I really can't accept that.
I don't think it's fair either.
I think we should, but before we get...
More susceptible to misinformation if you go in an academic context with your notebook and your questionnaire than if you go and live in the country and sit in cabs and sit in buses and listen to conversations on a daily basis.
Yeah, can we move on to a different question? We heard a little from him. We didn't hear a question. No, that was the problem. Can we have some more questions? I think you can discuss with the Cubans afterwards, I'm sure, but have you any questions to the people here? Deborah? Yeah, sure.
My name is Chuck Anderson. I'm a consumer. I'm concerned, I wonder what the panel thinks about the dual currency in Cuba, because it seems to me that that is a potential weak point in the socialist principles, because a few people in Cuba have access to a currency which is worth 24 times what everybody is paid in. And I wonder if this doesn't pose problems for the socialist principles.
Can everybody explain briefly the dual currency?
It does indeed pose problems.
Yeah.
It does pose problems. I mean, I have family in Cuba. I have relatives in Cuba who were very staunch supporters of the revolution, to the point that my family and that side of the family broke off ties for many, many years. My cousin is a teacher, and she's an educator and was very proud to be one, but her students would often tell her, why aren't you working at a hotel where they pay you in hard currency? And for years she resisted, until recently, when she actually quit being a teacher at the university and became a hotel worker. And she was penalized for that. She had to stay out of the workforce for a certain amount of time, then retrain. And she is now earning, and I've met so many people, and I know it's all anecdotal, but you meet so many people who tell you, you know, I'm earning more as a cab driver than I used to earn as an engineer, or all these sorts of things. And there's an issue there. And those people with cash, with hard cash and currency, do go to these stores. Some of them do begin to look more and more like shopping malls, I would say. I saw Chanel signs and Christian Dior the last time I was there. That was in 2004. So there is this opening up of this class breakdown, if you will. It's very, very small at the moment, but there is that, and that sense of frustration that, you know, I've been educated, and there is this hyper-educated society in Cuba, which is a great thing, but there's a feeling among many, many of those highly educated people that they have very little to do.
Pedro, the problem is that you have your Cuban pesos, which the Cuban people earn.
No, that's an anomaly.
But that's much less valuable than any dollars or the convertible currency.
I mean, I don't want to get into that.
But does that undermine the principles?
Oh, yeah, it's undermining it's undermining everything, but I don't want to go into tick-for-tack kind of experiences, because it doesn't make sense. All of us, we have a different experience in our life. We have a different experience with our partner, right? And always, I mean, I've been reading what had been written about my country, being here in England since 1981. It's unfair, one way or another, to savage the history and the endeavor and the work of a whole entire population. Like the Cuban people that make a lot of sacrifices. Of course, I was censoring Cuba, my writing and my poetry, 10 years without writing, right? One way I decided to go back to Cuba, the Cuban government didn't allow me just to trespass, to go beyond the Aeropuerto Rancho Boyeros in Cuba. I was fired from my job. I was fired because I was a journalist with Afro hair in the 1960s and 70s. I was pro the Black Power in Cuba, so I was fired from my job. But I am a revolutionario, and one for me is to overcome all the shit all along these 50 years in my country. You know why? Because my ancestors, that came to Cuba were slaves. My grandmother was a slave, period. And I managed to survive, and I am here with my almost 66 years old, happy that my family in Cuba are entitled to go to have education, to have free health care. I have free health care here in Britain, but they have it over there. But if you go to Brazil, or you go to Haiti, or you go to Venezuela, places I've been to, the people there are wondering, how could we get that? Education. When you go to Africa, you go to Ghana, you go to everywhere in Africa, you see black little boys around there, and they say, you should be in the school. No, I'm helping my dad. Right? 6, 7 years. That doesn't happen in Cuba. It happened before 1959 because I was there. So we have to put things in perspective. Of course, the new generation want to have too mobile. Don't forget that the Cubans are exageramos demasiado. Pardon? Right, but I'm saying before last year, we want to have mobile. They want to drive this. The people want to wear labels. My cousins ask me, send me a genuine Adidas. Genuine. They know label. They know everything. They want the real thing in Cuba. So, but they gave for granted what they have right now in Cuba. And of course, when you have a good education and you graduate in Informatica, you are a master in internet, and you want to make a lot of money and to drive a BMW. Of course, in Cuba, that life won't be for a long, long, long time.
Okay. Any more question back there? Oh. Okay. Yeah.
I want to ask something to a friend.
Emilio.
Yes, but before I want to say something, I am from Cuba, and I am from this new generation. I support Cuba, I support Fidel, I support the revolution, socialism, and many of my friends support Cuba, and they are young like me. I want to ask if you know anything about the Miami 5 and Posada Carriles, the terrorist who is living free in Miami.
It's a very specific political question. I think, I'm not sure it's the place to end.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Let's hear about the Miami 5.
Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah. Does everybody know who they are?
The Miami 5, which is actually, for once, he got that right, because at the BBC I'm always arguing with people about, don't call them the Cuba 5, they're called the Miami 5, and that's exactly what they're called, because they were here in Miami, and this is where they were convicted, and there's a lot of controversy around that conviction, and these are men who are considered heroes in Cuba for having stopped what people on that side say were terrorist attacks that were being plotted by radical exile groups here. Over here, obviously, they're seen completely the other way, and they were treated and tried and convicted as spies, and they're sitting in jail. And indeed, Posada Carriles, who is considered to have been the mastermind of the 1976 bombing of a Cuban plane with Cuban athletes with the fencing team returning home, and so many deaths there, more than 100 deaths, and I don't have the exact figure, but he is indeed on the streets or living freely, as you say, here in Miami. I don't think those kinds of issues, you're right in what you say, and they need to be flagged up, but I don't think that we start narrowing down. And as Pedro said earlier, and I took notice of what he said, we start going into this tit for tat discussion. We continue to be on either side of this divide between those on the outside and those on the inside of Cuba, and everybody has to be either extreme right wing or extreme left. Those things do happen, and I would agree that it's wrong if Mr. Posada Carriles was behind those attacks, that attack and others, that he should be roaming the streets freely. But I can't say that the other people necessarily shouldn't be in jail, because I don't have all the information at hand.
Okay, well, as Deborah says, I think we have to draw it to a close there. But as you've seen, Cuba is really unique, and the 50 years of revolution are something that's an outstanding event in world history. I think we've only just managed to scratch the surface, but I think on your behalf, I'd like to thank Emilio San Pedro in Miami. Steve Wilkinson from the Institute at the London Metropolitan University. Richard Gott from Man of the World. And Pedro Thank you all.